My name is Margaret Hale, and this is the story of how I refused to stay quiet. The memory still burns in my chest like a fire that refuses to die. There I stood, trembling with rage and determination, watching as the final election results flashed across the television screen. The numbers that would change everything. The numbers that proved them all wrong. But let me take you back to where it all began. Growing up in Millbrook was like living inside a snow globe. Beautiful from the outside, but suffocating once you realized you could never break free from the glass walls that surrounded you. This was a town where traditions ran deeper than the roots of the 100-year-old oak trees lining Main Street. Where women were expected to smile, nod and never, ever raise their voices too loud. My father, God rest his soul, used to look at me with those weathered eyes and say, "Silence keeps the peace, Margaret. Remember that." His words were meant to guide me, to protect me from a world he believed was too harsh for a woman's voice. But silence only kept me invisible. I learned this lesson the hard way, sitting in those suffocating community meetings month after month, year after year. The old Methodist church basement would fill with cigarette smoke, and the sound of men's voices echoing off the yellowing walls. I would sit there, my hands folded in my lap like a good little woman, watching as decisions were made about our community without a single thought given to what the women might think. But I could not stay quiet forever. The first time I raised my hand to ask a question, you could have heard a pin drop. 23 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me as if I had just announced I was from Mars. My heart hammered against my ribcage as I cleared my throat and asked about the healthcare situation in our town. Why did we have to drive 45 minutes to the nearest hospital? Why were our elderly residents suffering? Because they could not access proper medical care. The men in their wrinkled suits exchanged glances. Then came the chuckles. Soft at first, then growing louder. Council Chairman Robert Hendricks, a man whose belly had grown as large as his ego over the years, actually reached over and patted my shoulder like I was a confused child. "You are too emotional, Margaret," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Leave politics to us. We know what we are doing." Too emotional. The words hit me like a slap across the face. But I did not stop asking questions. The next month, I asked about jobs. Why had 3 businesses closed on Main Street in the past year? Why were our young people leaving town in droves, never to return? Why did we not have a single program to attract new industries to our community? Again the dismissive smiles. Again the patronizing pats on the shoulder. "Now, Margaret," said Councilman Frank Morrison, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "these are complex matters that require a man's perspective. Maybe you should focus on organizing the church bake sale instead." The church bake sale. As if my brain was only capable of comprehending cake recipes and frosting techniques. But still I persisted. 3 months later, I stood up and demanded to know why the park lights had not worked in 3 years. Why were our children forced to play in darkness? Why was the playground equipment rusting and dangerous? Why did it seem like our town was slowly dying while the men in charge did nothing but collect their paychecks and pat each other on the back? This time, the reaction was different. This time there was no laughter. Instead, I saw something much worse in their eyes. I saw anger. I saw the realization that I was not going to disappear quietly into the background like they had hoped. "Margaret," Chairman Hendricks said, his voice low and threatening, "you are disrupting these meetings with your constant complaints. Maybe it would be better if you found somewhere else to spend your evenings." Disrupting. That was their word for a woman who dared to care about her community. But every dismissal, every condescending smile, every patronizing pat on the shoulder planted something deep inside me. Not anger, exactly, but something much more powerful. Something that burned brighter and lasted longer. Fire. Pure unstoppable fire. I began to research everything I could about local government. I spent hours in the dusty corners of the library, reading policy documents and budget reports until my eyes ached. I learned about zoning laws and municipal bonds, about healthcare funding and economic development. I discovered that our town had been receiving state grants for infrastructure improvements, money that seemed to disappear into thin air without any visible improvements to show for it. The more I learned, the angrier I became. Not just angry, but devastated by the corruption and incompetence that had been strangling our community for decades. That was when I made the decision that would change everything. I decided to run for office. The morning I walked into the courthouse to file my paperwork, I could feel the weight of every stare, every whispered comment, every doubt pressing down on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Mrs. Henderson, who worked at the filing office, looked at me as if I had lost my mind completely. "You want to file for what position, dear?" she asked, her voice barely concealing her shock. "Town council," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "I want to run for town council." She blinked at me several times, as if the words had not registered properly in her brain. Are you sure about this, Margaret? I mean, it is quite a commitment. And you have children to think about." Children to think about. As if caring about my children's future was somehow incompatible with serving my community. "I am absolutely sure," I replied, placing my completed forms on the counter with a firmness that surprised even me. Word spread through Millbrook faster than a wildfire in August. By the time I got home from the courthouse, my phone was already ringing off the hook. Some calls were supportive, but most were not. "Margaret, what are you thinking?" my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, demanded over the phone. "Politics is no place for a mother. What about your family? What about your reputation?" My reputation? As if my reputation was more important than the future of our community. But the phone calls were nothing compared to what happened when I announced my candidacy at the next community meeting. I stood up in that same church basement where I had been dismissed so many times before, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest, and cleared my throat. "I have an announcement to make," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. "I am running for town council, and I am running to bring real change to this community." The silence that followed was deafening. Then slowly, like a dam bursting, came the laughter. Not the polite chuckles I had grown accustomed to, but deep, belly-shaking laughter that echoed off the basement walls. Chairman Hendricks was practically doubled over, tears streaming down his red face. "Margaret Hale for town council," he wheezed between gasps. "That is the funniest thing I have heard all year." But the laughter was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, the whispers grew louder and more vicious. I would walk into the grocery store and conversation would stop mid-sentence. I would pass groups of women on the street and watch them lean in close to each other, their eyes following me like I was some kind of dangerous animal that had escaped from the zoo. "She is just a mother," I heard them say. "What does she know about running a town? Just a mother." As if being a mother had not taught me more about budgeting, crisis management, and long-term planning than any business degree ever could. "She is too loud for her own good," others whispered. "Always causing trouble, always stirring up drama." Too loud. The same accusation that had been following me my entire life. But the worst came from a man I had known since childhood. Dr. Richard Thornton, who had delivered both of my children, pulled me aside after church one Sunday morning. "Margaret," he said, his face serious and concerned, "I have known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. I delivered your babies, watched you grow into a fine woman and mother. But this political nonsense has to stop." Political nonsense. Fighting for better health care, safer parks, and economic growth was nonsense to him. Why does it have to stop? I asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning. His expression grew stern, almost angry. "Because we do not want your kind of voice here," he said, the words hitting me like physical blows. "This town has functioned just fine for generations without women interfering in men's business. We like things the way they are." Your kind of voice. The phrase echoed in my mind for days afterward. What kind of voice did I have? A voice that asked difficult questions. A voice that demanded accountability. A voice that refused to accept, "That is just the way things are," as an answer? If that was the kind of voice they did not want, then I was determined to give them more of it than they could handle. So I gave them my voice everywhere. I spoke at the grocery store, engaging shoppers in conversations about property taxes and infrastructure while we waited in line. I shared my vision for economic development while selecting produce, talking about how we could attract new businesses and create jobs for our young people. I spoke in church basements, organizing informal meetings with women who had never been asked their opinions about community issues. We talked about everything from school funding to senior citizen services, from public safety to environmental concerns. These women had opinions, ideas, and solutions that had been ignored for decades. I spoke on street corners, setting up a folding table and chair wherever people gathered. At the farmer's market, outside the post office, in the parking lot of the hardware store. I talked to anyone who would listen about my plans for transparent government, fiscal responsibility, and community engagement. Every conversation was a small victory. Every person who stopped to listen, even if they ultimately disagreed with me, was proof that my voice mattered, that my ideas had value, that I belonged in this fight. The established politicians were not pleased with my grassroots approach. She is making a spectacle of herself, Chairman Hendricks complained to anyone who would listen. Running around town like some kind of carnival barker. It is undignified. Undignified. Apparently, talking directly to constituents was beneath the dignity of proper politicians. But I was not running to be dignified. I was running to be effective. My campaign was unlike anything Millbrook had ever seen. I could not afford fancy advertisements or professional consultants. Instead, I relied on something much more powerful. Authentic connections with real people. I knocked on every door in town, sometimes twice. I listened to elderly residents worry about rising prescription costs and inadequate public transportation. I heard from working parents who struggled to find quality, affordable childcare. I talked to teenagers who felt hopeless about their futures, convinced that they would have to leave town to find opportunities. Each conversation broke my heart and strengthened my resolve simultaneously. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, an 87-year-old widow, invited me into her tiny kitchen and served me coffee in a chipped china cup that had belonged to her grandmother. "Margaret," she said, her hands shaking slightly as she poured. "I have lived in this town for 63 years. I have watched it slowly die while the men in charge just talk and talk and talk. Nothing ever changes. Nothing ever gets better." Her eyes filled with tears as she continued. "My late husband used to say that women had too much sense to get involved in politics. That we were too smart to waste our time with all the arguing and posturing. But you know what? Maybe that is exactly why we need women in politics. Maybe we need people who care more about solving problems than winning arguments." Her words stayed with me through the long, exhausting months of campaigning. There were moments when I wanted to quit. Moments when the criticism became so harsh and personal that I questioned whether I was strong enough for this fight. When people called me selfish for running, claiming that I was neglecting my family for personal ambition. When they suggested that my husband must be weak for allowing his wife to pursue such foolish dreams. My children faced harassment at school. Other parents pulled their children away from mine at the playground. Some of my oldest friends stopped calling, stopped inviting me to social events, stopped acknowledging my existence entirely. The isolation was crushing. But then I would receive a phone call from a single mother who was inspired by my campaign. Or a note from a teenage girl who said I had shown her that women could be leaders too. Or a visit from a group of elderly women who had never voted in a local election before, but were registering specifically to support my candidacy. These moments of connection, of hope, of shared determination, carried me through the darkest days of the campaign. As election day approached, the attacks intensified. Anonymous flyers appeared around town, questioning my qualifications, my motives, and my character. Someone started a rumor that I was only running to get attention, that I would drop out before the election. Another rumor suggested that my husband was secretly opposed to my candidacy and was only supporting me publicly to avoid embarrassment. The rumors were painful, but they also revealed something important. My opponents were scared. For the first time in decades, they faced a real challenge to their authority. They could no longer take their positions for granted. Election night arrived like a storm that had been building on the horizon for months. I stood in the crowded community center, surrounded by supporters and opponents alike, watching as the results trickled in precinct by precinct. The air was thick with tension and cigarette smoke, the walls seeming to vibrate with nervous energy. At first I was behind. The early returns showed Chairman Hendricks leading by a comfortable margin, just as everyone had predicted. I felt my stomach drop as I watched the numbers on the bulletin board. each update seeming to confirm what my critics had said all along. That I was naive, that I was in over my head, that I should have stayed home where I belonged. But then something extraordinary began to happen. Precinct by precinct, the tide began to shift. The rural areas, where I had spent countless hours knocking on doors and listening to farmers' concerns about water rights and agricultural regulations, started reporting strong support for my candidacy. The working-class neighborhoods, where I had organized kitchen table discussions about healthcare costs and job training programs, began delivering overwhelming margins in my favor. The senior citizen housing complex, where I had spent hours listening to stories about financial struggles and medical challenges, reported voter turnout that exceeded anything in the complex's history. With each update, the gap between Hendricks and me grew smaller, then disappeared entirely, then reversed. The room grew quieter as people began to realize what was happening. The impossible was becoming possible. The unthinkable was actually occurring. When the final precinct reported its results, the room fell completely silent. I had won. Not by a narrow margin, not by a lucky break, but by a landslide that no one had seen coming. 68% of the vote. The largest victory margin in a contested town council race in Millbrook's history. The same men who had laughed at me, dismissed me, and tried to silence me now had to stand up from their chairs. They had to clap their hands, even if the applause was forced and reluctant. They had to address me by my new title, Councilwoman Margaret Hale. The moment felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. All those months of criticism and doubt, all those voices telling me to stay quiet and know my place, all those predictions that I would embarrass myself and my family, all of it had been wrong. But the real moment of triumph came when I stepped up to the microphone to give my victory speech. I looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people who had supported me and people who had opposed me, at the journalists who had mostly ignored my campaign until tonight, at the children who had stayed up late to witness this historic moment. I could have gloated. I could have listed all the ways my opponents had underestimated me. I could have reminded everyone of all the times they had told me to stay quiet. Instead, I leaned into the microphone and spoke from my heart. Tonight we have proven that in America, every voice matters, I began, my words carrying clearly through the silent room. We have shown that when people are tired of being ignored, tired of being dismissed, tired of being told that their concerns do not matter, they can rise up and demand to be heard. I paused, looking directly at some of the men who had spent months trying to convince the town that I was unqualified and dangerous. I want to thank everyone who voted for me tonight, but I also want to acknowledge those who supported my opponents. You are not my enemies. You are my neighbors, my fellow citizens, my partners in building a stronger community. I may not have earned your vote this time, but I promise you that I will work every single day to earn your trust. The room remained perfectly quiet, hanging on every word. This victory is not just mine, I continued, feeling the emotion rising in my throat. This victory belongs to every woman who was told she was too emotional to understand politics. This victory belongs to every mother who was told that caring for her family meant she could not also care for her community. This victory belongs to every person who was told to stay quiet when they saw injustice and incompetence. My voice grew stronger as I spoke, carrying the weight of all those months of struggle and determination. For every woman who was told to stay quiet, for every voice that was dismissed as unimportant, for every person who was told that they did not belong in positions of leadership, this win is for you. And then I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I stopped talking. I stepped back from the microphone and let the silence fill the room. But this time it was different. This time the silence was not empty or oppressive. This time, the silence carried power. My power. The power of a woman who had refused to be silenced, who had fought for her voice and won the right to be heard. The room remained quiet for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly the applause began. Not the forced, reluctant clapping from before, but genuine, heartfelt applause that grew louder and stronger until the entire room was on its feet. In that moment, I realized that I had not just won an election. I had started a revolution. A quiet revolution that would inspire other women to find their voices, to demand their seats at the table, to refuse to be silenced by those who preferred their compliance to their competence. As I stood there, surrounded by the sound of applause and the faces of people who finally saw me not as a troublemaker or an anomaly, but as their elected representative, I thought about all the women who would come after me, the daughters and granddaughters who would grow up knowing that their voices mattered, that their dreams were valid, that their place was wherever they chose to claim it. The victory was sweet, but the real prize was bigger than any election. The real prize was the knowledge that silence would no longer be required of women in Millbrook. That questions would be welcomed rather than dismissed. That competence would matter more than compliance. That night, as I drove home through the quiet streets of my town, I rolled down the windows and felt the cool night air on my face. For the first time in my adult life, I was not afraid of being too loud. I was not worried about asking too many questions or challenging too many assumptions. I was Councilwoman Margaret Hale, and I had earned my voice through determination, courage, and an absolute refusal to accept the limitations that others tried to place on me. The next morning, I woke up ready to get to work. There were budgets to review, policies to examine, and a community to serve. There were still men who doubted my abilities and women who questioned my priorities. There were still problems to solve and changes to make. But now I had something I had never had before: a platform, a voice, and the unshakable knowledge that I belonged exactly where I was. They had told me to stay quiet. Instead, I had run for office and won. And this was only the beginning. If this story inspired you to find your own voice and refuse to be silenced, please subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, determination, and triumph over adversity. Your support helps us share these powerful narratives with women everywhere who need to know that their voices matter too. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of strong, fearless individuals who refuse to stay quiet when the world needs their voices most.